What if I told you a country holds more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, more than any nation on earth, and yet cannot consistently feed its own people? That country is Venezuela. And this is the story of how the world's richest oil curse was made. By 1970, Venezuela was one of the 20 richest countries in the world, with a per capita income higher than Spain, Greece, and Israel, and only about 13% below that of the United Kingdom. Caracas was a cosmopolitan boom city where Venezuelans flew to Miami for weekend shopping and called it Dame Do's, give me two, because everything felt affordable. Oil money had transformed a largely agricultural society into one of the fastest-growing economies in the world in the span of a generation. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary economic success story for a while. The transformation had begun decades earlier when foreign oil companies struck massive petroleum deposits beneath Venezuelan soil, and by mid-century Venezuela had become one of the top oil exporters in the world. The country nationalized its oil industry in 1976, creating the state company PDVSA, which for a time maintained genuine professional and technical discipline despite the political shift. Oil came to account for the vast majority of government revenue and foreign exchange. The country's economic engine was singular and powerful. What seemed like an inexhaustible fountain of national wealth would prove to be the foundation of every future catastrophe. Economists call it the resource curse, or Dutch disease, the paradox where a country's natural resource wealth quietly hollows out its broader economic foundation. When oil revenues flood an economy, the national currency strengthens, making manufacturing, farming, and non-oil exports progressively uncompetitive until they wither away. Venezuela's non-oil industries did exactly that. They quietly disappeared as imported goods, paid for with oil dollars, replaced domestic production. When global oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, Venezuela had almost nothing left to fall back on, and the seeds of disaster, planted during decades of apparent abundance, were already deep in the soil. In 1999, Hugo Chávez swept to power on a wave of genuine popular anger at decades of elite corruption and inequality. Millions of Venezuelans had seen very little of their country's extraordinary oil wealth. He promised to redirect petroleum revenues toward the poor through healthcare, literacy campaigns, and food subsidies known as misiones, and for a period rising global oil prices gave him the revenues to deliver on those promises. But Chávez was not simply a reformer, he was constructing a political order in which every major economic institution was subordinated to personal and ideological loyalty. The country's most vital industry would pay the price for that choice. In the aftermath of the 2002-2003 opposition strike, Chávez made the decision that would seal Venezuela's economic fate for the next 2 decades. He fired approximately 18,000 PDVSA employees, close to 40% of the entire company workforce, including engineers, geologists, drilling specialists, and the accumulated technical expertise of entire careers. In their place he installed political loyalists whose primary qualification was loyalty to the revolution rather than any knowledge of petroleum extraction or refinery operations. For a brief time it barely registered oil prices were surging globally, but the technical backbone of Venezuela's most critical national asset had been quietly and permanently destroyed. Venezuela had been producing 3.4 million barrels of oil per day at its 1998 peak, a figure that made it a genuine global energy power and a pillar of OPEC. After the mass firings gutted technical capacity, production began a slow but relentless decline as aging infrastructure went unmaintained, replacement expertise could not be built fast enough, and foreign investment dried up following the expropriation of international oil company assets without comparable reinvestment. By the mid-2020s, production had collapsed to under 1 million barrels per day, less than a third of its 1998 peak, despite Venezuela holding the world's largest proven reserves. It was as if the owner of the world's most valuable mine had lost all ability to dig. To keep basic goods affordable for ordinary Venezuelans, the government introduced sweeping price controls, fixing the prices of food, medicine, and fuel at levels that made production economically impossible for private suppliers and farmers. When a company or farmer cannot cover the cost of producing a product at the legally mandated price, they stop producing it, and that is precisely what happened, at scale, across Venezuela's entire domestic economy. During the oil boom years, the government simply imported whatever the controls had caused to vanish from shelves, using petroleum dollars to paper over the damage. Venezuela was not building an economy, it was renting the appearance of one, and the rent was paid entirely in oil revenues that would not last forever. In 2014, global oil prices fell sharply, roughly halving from their peak in a matter of months, and the economic trap Venezuela had been constructing for over a decade finally snapped shut. Nicolas Maduro, who had inherited the presidency after Chávez died in 2013, faced a stark choice: begin painful structural economic reforms, or print money to maintain spending and avoid short-term political pain. He chose to print again and again as foreign currency reserves evaporated and the Venezuelan bolivar entered a spiral of devaluation that would prove effectively endless. Every structural failure that oil revenue had been masking for years now surfaced simultaneously. What followed entered the record books as one of the most extreme inflation events in the history of modern economics. Around 2018, prices rose by over 1,000,000% on an annual basis, meaning the same bag of groceries that cost a family 1 unit of currency in January would cost 10,000 units by December. The government responded by printing more money and eventually redenominating the currency multiple times, slashing zeros from banknotes without ever addressing the underlying fiscal catastrophe that was generating new zeros faster than they could be removed. Families had to carry bags stuffed with currency notes simply to make ordinary daily purchases, and even that was often not enough because the shelves were empty. The food crisis became the human face of Venezuela's economic collapse, the moment where abstract macroeconomic failure became visible on the bodies of children. Even during oil boom years, Venezuela had been importing the majority of its food rather than investing in domestic agricultural capacity, and when the oil revenues collapsed, the food imports stopped too. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Food Programme estimated that more than 9 million Venezuelans, close to a third of the population, were facing food insecurity. In a nation sitting atop the world's largest oil reserves, people were searching garbage piles for something to eat. When a country fails its people to this degree, people leave, and Venezuela's exodus became one of the largest forced migrations in the history of the Western Hemisphere. By the mid-2020s, more than 7.9 million Venezuelans had fled the country, more than 1 in every 5 citizens, crossing jungles on foot, fording rivers, and rebuilding shattered lives in Colombia, Peru, Chile, and across the Americas. Doctors became street vendors in foreign cities, engineers drove taxis, teachers sold food on sidewalks. Venezuela lost an entire generation of its most educated and capable citizens, the very people who might have rebuilt the country in the span of a few devastating years. Here is the cruelest arithmetic of Venezuela's story: the oil is still there. Over 300 billion barrels sit beneath Venezuelan soil by official estimates, the largest proven reserve on Earth, and those reserves did not run out. The capacity to extract, process, and sell them did. U.S. sanctions imposed and tightened from the late 2010s onward added significant pressure and restricted market access, but the structural collapse of PDVSA's technical capacity and the broader economic ruin long predated those restrictions. Venezuela became the country that owns the world's greatest underground treasure while its people stood in lines for bread, a paradox that economic historians will study for generations. To understand how completely different Venezuela's outcome could have been, consider Norway, a country that also discovered major petroleum reserves in the late 1960s and faced the same defining question about what to do with sudden resource wealth. Norway built a sovereign wealth fund, the government pension fund global ring-fenced from ordinary government spending, with professional independent management insulated from political interference, and kept its state oil company on strict technical and safety standards regardless of political winds. Today that fund holds over $1 trillion in global assets, invested for future generations, a permanent national inheritance built from exactly the same type of resource that Venezuela squandered through political choices. Venezuela's tragedy is not ultimately a story about oil, it is a story about what happens when a government mistakes resource wealth for economic strength, when political loyalty replaces technical competence at scale, and when short-term popularity is purchased with long-term ruin. The oil curse is real, but it is not inevitable. Botswana transformed diamonds into sustained development, Chile built fiscal discipline around copper revenues, and Norway turned petroleum into permanent generational wealth. Venezuela had the reserves, the history, the educated workforce, and the time to make different choices, and made catastrophic ones at every critical turning point. The barrels are still there beneath the soil. Whether Venezuela gets another chance to use them wisely is one of the defining economic questions of the decades ahead.